Hello, everyone. We are about to begin the event. My name is Amy Hamrai. I am an associate professor of medicine, health, and society, and I'm one of the faculty fellows in the Imagining Cities group at the Robert Penn Warren Center this year. I am very excited to introduce Shannon Mattern, who is our speaker tonight. Shannon is a professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research. Her writing and teaching focus on archives, libraries, and other media spaces, media infrastructures, spatial epistemologies, and mediated sensation and exhibition. She is the author of several books, including The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities, Deep Mapping the Media City, and Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, all of which were published by the University of Minnesota Press. And her upcoming book is called The City is Not a Computer, and that's forthcoming in August from Princeton University Press, and you can actually pre-order it now. Very excited for that. She also contributes a regular long form column about urban data and mediated infrastructures to Places Journal, which is a journal of built environments. And she collaborates on public design and interactive projects and exhibitions. And we are very excited in our faculty group to invite Shannon to visit with us because her work touches on so many of the different areas that we're interested in. And really, she's doing some of the most creative work in urban humanities that we know of. So with that, I will hand it over to Shannon, and I will let you all know that if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and then when we get to the Q&A section, I will read them aloud and moderate. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. It's especially an honor to be invited by Amy, whose work I have greatly admired for a very long time. So yeah, I'm going to share a new project. It's connected to the issues of urban studies and cities, which are essential, obviously, to the work that the Imagining Cities project is doing. But because I've been writing about that for a long time, I kind of wanted to add a new dimension because I have grew up amidst the trees on the side of a mountain in a hardware store, so surrounded by wood. So I wanted to add some environmental humanities to the urban humanities, I guess you could say. So this talk is about trees, and it's the first little part, a lot of research yet to do on something that might become a book someday. I'm not sure. It could just be an article, yet to be determined. So I will get started. All right. A lot of momentous decisions have been made under trees. These arboreal agents have seeded the moral and ethical germination, hybridization, invasion, and on occasion, decimation of races and nations. Eve's choice to consume forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil ultimately condemned humanity to sin, suffering, judgment, and death. The tree of life, meanwhile, is central to most of the world's religions and mythologies. Similarly planted in the deep past, or if you were to ask Western scholars, sometime in the 15th century CE, the Iroquois nation's great peacemaker and his disciple, Hiawatha, brought together leaders from the Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca nations to form a confederacy. The peacemaker directed those gathered to uproot a great white pine, creating, quote, a cavity in which to bury all weapons of war, end quote. This great tree of peace, with its needles and clusters of 5, has come to symbolize the 5-part union. In 1681, French trapper and trader La Salle summoned representatives from the Potawatomi, Miami, Illinois, and other tribes to discuss their potential union against the Iroquois, who we just mentioned, who happened to be these other tribes' common enemy. They allegedly gathered at the Council Oak in South Bend, South Bend, Indiana, to sign a treaty, one that would eventually clear the ground for new alliances and divisions among native tribes, the French and the English. Shortly afterward, in 1683, William Penn met with Tamanend, chief of the Lenape Turtle Clan in the Lenape village of Shakamaxon, now Philadelphia's fish town, to sign a peace treaty under an elm. Many trees present for deciding battles of the Civil War, the Burnside sycamore in Sharpsburg, Maryland, the Sickles oak at Gettysburg, and the Manassas white oak survive and are today revered and protected as witness trees. Many of their sylvan siblings south of the Mason-Dixon served as scaffolds upon which a perversion of justice was exercised on Black bodies, and many continued to witness lynchings well into the 20th century. These witness trees chronicle the long and bloody process by which the United States decided upon its moral and political past and future. Trees have also grounded decisions pertaining to the founding of cities and institutions and movements, the partitioning of land and cultivation of civic identity. Legend has it that in the early 16th century, Spanish conquistadors founded the city of Havana under a ceiba tree in the Plaza de Armas. They held the first cabildo, or town council meeting, and mass there too. On May 17, 1792, 24 stockbrokers purportedly gathered under a buttonwood tree on Wall Street in New York City and decided to sign the Buttonwood Agreement, which established the stock market that would eventually become the New York Stock Exchange. New England's elms, often spared the settler farmer's axe because of their recalcitrance in the carpenter's woodshop, as well as their value in providing shelter for field livestock, served as boundary markers. Their convenient, charismatic presence helped planners and cartographers decide where to draw lines on the map. These arboreal agents became legal instruments that were assured a lasting place in the landscape, writes Thomas Campanella in Republic of Shade. Meanwhile, the region's elms assumed a civic role in many a New England village. Even the decision in the early 19th century to give pride of place to elms rather than imported species like Embodied poplars, once valued because they presumably brought classicism and exoticism to the American landscape, signaled the rise of a new arbor nationalism, a pride in native species, as well as a belief that elms gave form to the values municipal leaders wanted to instill in their community: order, good character, and virtuous deportment. Large indigenous specimens near the town center served as community totems, and as secular counterparts to the meeting house. Townsfolk held elections and recruited soldiers in their shade and paused there to listen to orators and firebrands of every stripe. Minds were changed, decisions made under their boughs. One thing I neglected to say up front is that I am joining you from the unceded territory of the Lenape people. I'm just a little bit north of New York City. I regret having forgotten to say that at the very beginning. In Queensland, Australia, workers gathered under a ghost gum tree in front of the Barcaldine railway station, and in 1887 ultimately organized the Central Queensland Carriers Union. This tree of knowledge later hosted a reading of the Labour Party manifesto, which led to the founding of the party. In Somalia, elders have for centuries gathered under acacia trees to resolve disputes in accordance with Zir, their customary legal system. And in other parts of Africa and Australia, baobab trees, which can live to be thousands of years old, have long hosted civic meetings, open-air markets, and religious ceremonies. As Dion Searcy writes, Senegal's baobabs serve as town halls, gathering places where municipal decisions are made, babies named, and scores settled. They too have shaped the terrain and cultivated the communities, many of which are urban, around them. Quote, Senegal has few rivers and no mountains, so baobabs sprout from the scrubby landscape as majestic waypoints. Throughout history, entire communities were constructed around these trees, end quote. The trees have guided decisions regarding navigation, congregation, and settlement. Again, although I don't reference explicitly the urban throughout this talk, any reference to kind of social gatherings or the organization, the planning of space around them could easily be extrapolated to apply to urban imaginaries. The Barcaldine Tree of Knowledge was poisoned in 2006. Both the oak and baobab arboreal agents and democratic processes in everyday decision-making are succumbing to slower violences, as we might say, as democracy, the discussions happening underneath the trees itself. The elm leaf beetle arrived in the US in 1834, and the elm bark beetle and the fungal pathogen it disseminates began destroying Northern European elms in 1918, then spread throughout the world. Increased global trade and climate change only exacerbate the danger posed by new insects and pathogens. Meanwhile, climate change, urbanization, and population growth threaten the baobab. Drought is driving elephants to dig into the trees to access their interior water stores, causing lethal damage. The same forces, climate crisis, development, and extraction, are threatening forests worldwide. We find within the same ecology myriad factors that are endangering democracy and our capacity for informed, reasoned decision-making, all the decisions that we're at one point happening under so many of these trees. Digital technology both amplifies and accelerates the forces driving development, and it is itself a beneficiary of increased extraction. Its operation depends upon hardware composed of mined materials. Its detritus constitutes toxic waste. The rise of social media has led to extraction, pollution, and decay of a different form: the mining of users' data, the manufacturing of misinformation, the sowing of conspiracy, the rise of extremism, the decline of trust, the fracturing of publics, and the dissolution of community. Communication scholars Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner, in their new book, You Are Here, the long subtitle of which you can see here, A Field Guide for Navigating Polarized Speech, Conspiracy Theories, and Our Polluted Media Landscape, even frame the deterioration of our democratic communication systems as an environmental crisis. Quote, polluted information seeps through our networks. Everyday decisions help spread that pollution, and overlapping energies fuel media storms, end quote. This leads us to our first section called Sylvan Solutions. The proposed solutions to these compounding crises, climatological, epistemological, democratic, and in some ways urban as well, often involve more of the same: more trees, more data, more computational modeling. Trees are a particularly appealing solution to a whole host of problems. In 2019, a team based at ETH Zurich mapped the potential global tree canopy and discovered that the world could accommodate an additional 0.9 billion hectares of canopy cover, which could store over 200 gigatons of carbon. Ecosystem restoration, they concluded, is one of the most effective solutions at our disposal to mitigate climate change, end quote. What's more, a member of the team told The Guardian, tree planting doesn't require an obstructionist president or prime minister to immediately start believing in climate change, or scientists to come up with technological solutions to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Anyone can plant a tree, and doing so doesn't require sacrifices or systemic change. Hence the popularity of initiatives like the 1 Trillion Tree campaign as a means to combat climate change. 1 billion people each planting a tree without thinking much about it or about the destructive systems creating the crisis can cumulatively constitute an accidentally automated global solution. Many such arboreal initiatives are infused with a new kind of tree logic. While the council oak and Senegalese baobab served as arboreal agents for deliberative decision-making, new sylvan forms are scaffolding decision-making in global environmental policy, urban administration, design, and a whole host of fields and contexts. These trees of deliberation, the elms under which momentous decisions have been made, are being replaced with digital descendants, decision trees. Decision trees are the artificial dendrological descendants of Campanella's elm and Hiawatha's white pine. A decision tree is an algorithm that functions like a flowchart. It subjects a data set to a series of questions or if-then statements, addressing one variable at a time, in order to iteratively split the data into branches and ultimately into leaf nodes, representing a final classification or decision. If we were using an algorithm to determine where to plant trees in a particular city, for example, we might start first at the root node at that very top by asking questions about a neighborhood's existing tree canopy. If it already has a disproportionate number of trees, we probably don't want to concentrate our attention there. At each subsequent stage in recursive partitioning, we need to ask questions that allow us to successively split the data into branches with maximum purity or homogeneity, which means that all data belong to the same class. This drive for purity can sometimes lead to what's called overfitting, which compromises the algorithm's generalizable utility for other data sets. Modeling machine learning through decision trees, sociologist Adrienne McKenzie explains, helps to make its computational processes observable and comprehensible, yet the cost of that intelligibility is a highly restricted framing of differences and overemphasis on the purity of its classifications. We might also deploy what's called a random forest, which, as the name implies, is an ensemble, a forest, of decision trees, designed such that each node works on a random subset of variables. Those trees are run in parallel, and their results are then aggregated. The utility of a random forest, much like the hardiness of a biological forest, depends on diversity. Random forests can help us to alleviate overfitting and readily lend themselves to generalizable uses. But because of the complexity and randomness of their operations, they take longer to train, and they're much more difficult to interpret. Again, as with the biological forest, random forests constitute an ecology in which a host of agents and environmental variables affect the system's operation. And it's hard to isolate the impact of any single variable. In late 2020, Google launched its Tree Canopy Lab, which uses artificial intelligence to examine aerial imagery and public data on population density, land use, and heat risk to estimate tree canopy coverage in Los Angeles, and eventually many more cities, with the expectation that such visualizations could inform tree planting efforts to reduce CO2 emissions, improve air quality, mitigate urban heat islands, and thereby enhance public health. As Justine Kalma reported in The Verge, the lab showed that in Los Angeles, neighborhoods with the highest heat risk tended to be more densely populated with people, but less densely covered with trees. Basically, the places at greatest risk for heat illness and death have fewer resources to deal with it. Around the same time, conservation nonprofit American Forests partnered with Microsoft to introduce its Tree Equity Score, which graphs together data about a neighborhood's existing tree canopy, population density, income, race, age, surface temperature, and employment to determine how the presence or absence of trees might map onto other forms of racial or socioeconomic inequity. Once their score, on a scale of 1 to 100, is displayed on a colorful cartographic dashboard, communities have a clear sense of what work needs to be done, and they can establish a plan for the targeted planting of new trees. Then, once we've plotted and planted, we can deploy an assemblage of digital tools to continually map those forests, count their trees, identify their leaves, assess their health and risks. Not only forests, but also street trees could easily be subjected to this and are subjected to this type of computational kind of accounting and modeling also. In his inventory of datafied tree projects, Jonathan Gray explains that some trees have been assigned unique identifiers and social media handles to enable residents to report on their condition, and to enable the trees themselves to tweet about their own activity. Smartphone apps can assist with tree identification, and other modes of data collection support community-led tree inventorying, tree mapping, and arboreal citizen science projects. I know New York has quite a host of activities like this. I imagine Nashville or wherever you are might as well. Local activists in Sumatra are installing treetop monitoring units, used cell phones powered by solar panels, specially designed to work in densely foliated terrains, to listen for and distinguish between the sounds of chainsaws, logging trucks, and other sonic cues of illegal logging. Even big tech has entered the sector, toting its satellites, sensors, LiDAR, and high-powered computing initiatives. NASA is deploying a range of satellite-mounted instruments, the Cloud and the Earth's Radiant Energy System, the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer, and it's launching experiments, including the Ecosystem Spaceborne Thermal Radiometer Experiment, the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation aboard the space station, to assess the impact of deforestation and the remediating potential of reforestation. Google, through its partnership with Global Forest Watch and Microsoft, are invested in similar enterprises.
Hundreds of millions of acres of forest in the United States. What's happening with them today is the result of centuries of past decision-making. Forests are made up of complex, interconnected systems, and there's never been a way to measure all of these systems, and you can't manage what you can't measure. Through Microsoft's AI for Good initiative, we've created the first high-resolution inventory of all U.S. forests to provide better data and to make better decisions.
So apologies for my awkward cuts. I'm not great at video editing, but anyway, so just to repeat, forests are made up of complex interconnected systems, and there's never been a way to measure all of those systems, notes Zach Parisa, co-founder of the Sylvia Terra Carbon Credit Exchange. That's the business they're in here, that's what they're selling, an enterprise built on Microsoft AI. And he reminds us, you can't manage what you can't measure, an often repeated mantra throughout not only kind of forest management, tree management, but kind of really any urban or smart system. And here's another example.
Imagine if we had a planetary computer that could tell us exactly what we needed to do to protect planet Earth. A system that was capable of providing us information about every tree, every species, all of our natural resources. How could we use all of that data to build a better world? True innovation hinges on our ability to see things differently. It means breaking boundaries and looking between the lines in an effort to solve some of the world's toughest challenges. Planetary scale innovation is needed now more than ever. Because if we truly care about each other, then we have got to care about this planet that we all call home. And that is something that we have been failing at for far too long.
I let that go on a little bit longer just because I'm so interested in kind of the formalism of a lot of these videos, these weird kind of implantations of set designs and green screens and squares imposed on the organic forms of the forest. These are kind of recurring tropes that we'll see in a few examples. And then are in other examples that I didn't include here. But this was Lucas Joppa, who is Microsoft's chief environmental engineer. And he offers up an even more ambitious plan than the Sylvia Terra people did. Even more ambitious ecological epistemological imaginary. Quote, imagine if we had a planetary computer that could tell us exactly what we needed to do to protect planet Earth, a system that was capable of providing us with information about every tree, every species, all of our natural resources. Imagine that, wow, and how we could use all that data to build a better world, end quote. In other words, he's proposing to, for using algorithms, save a random forest with a random forest. Jennifer Gabrice warns that such practices could present the problem of environmental change through a particular set of metrics that in turn legitimate specific technological interventions to meet targets for averting environmental catastrophe, end quote. In other words, they could promote techno-solutionist responses to ecological, cultural, and political economic problems, which we also see manifested in proposals to solve the climate crisis, not by curbing extraction or consumption, but by perfecting carbon capture and fossil fuel recovery. We see the same mentality applied in kind of smart and data-driven urban solutions all the time as well. Here, it's easier to plant a tree and to have a generative design dashboard tell you precisely where it needs to be planted than it is to change an entire society's consumption habits or eliminate fossil fuels. The notion that tree planting is an elixir for what ails the earth is as popular with polluters as it is with nations, a fact that spawned the carbon offset industry, Ted Williams writes in Slate. Data-driven precision planting alone is a form of techno-vegetal solutionism. Google's, Microsoft's, Facebook's, and Amazon's concern with trees and sustainability is also, at least in part, an opportunity to greenwash their own extractive, energy-intensive operations. What's more, Gabrish says, such tools for sylvan surveillance risk, What's more, Gabrish says, such tools for sylvan surveillance risk rendering forests as stores of timber or carbon sinks, not as sites that sustain cultural narratives or indigenous cosmologies. That's what I get for putting in too much alliteration. Sentences that are hard to say. Of course, this isn't a new problem. The rise of scientific forestry in Prussia and Saxony in the late 18th century, James C. Scott tells us, abstracted and operationalized the forest as an economic resource to be managed efficiently and profitably. For foresters, the actual tree with its vast number of possible uses was replaced by an abstract tree representing a volume of lumber or firewood. And that this new epistemological framing of the tree leads us to our next section on trees and knowledge. While the transformation of trees into data might seem like a modern phenomenon, the use of trees to record data has a much longer history. Sumerians fashioned reeds into the styli they used to make wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets. Much of that early writing was administrative. It was the recording of data. So they weren't typically writing literature, it was more kind of accounting of transactions. Egyptians pressed strips of papyrus into the sheets on which they wrote texts in red and black inks, themselves composed of charcoal and acacia gum mixed with lead or copper. Later, around the 2nd century BCE, the Chinese began mashing tree bark, hemp, and rags together to make paper. The knowledge produced through and on these botanical apparatus was sometimes then represented in the form of a tree. Tree thinking is rooted deep in the history of classification, which we can trace back to classical philosophy, perhaps most explicitly in the Arbor Porphyriana, described by Porphyry in the 3rd century BCE in his one of his texts as a means of dividing genera into species, and later transformed into a tree diagram by medieval logicians. The tree's layered differentiating factors you can see here, we might say, split the tree into leaf nodes like a decision tree. Such tree models served functions both practical and philosophical. Etymologies written by Isidore of Seville in the 7th century CE references stemma, or twigs, that lawyers draw so that they can then measure the degrees of kinship. He then, in the book, offers 3 diagrams, 3 variations on the arbor juris, which, as Jean-Baptiste Piggin describes, had been used in Roman law systems for 2 millennia to determine the legal boundaries of kinship. It helps compute, for example, which kinfolk may marry without committing incest, which kin are exempt from testifying against an accused. These proto-family trees serve to guide moral, ethical, and legal decisions. Raymond Lull's Arbor Scientiae, or Tree of Science, written in the late 13th century, classified human knowledge into 16 categories, each represented by a tree. Yet many epistemological trees of the medieval period, Scott Weingart writes, featured single roots from which all knowledge branched, based either in an ancient knowledge category or, more frequently, in God or some angelic form. Descartes' 17th century principles of philosophy put metaphysics at its root and physics in the trunk. A century later, the encyclopedists Denis Diderot and Jean Léron de Lambert sought to reject genealogical orders, arguing that maps of human knowledge are arbitrary and infinite in possibility. And while the universe might be but a vast ocean on the surface of which we perceive a few islands whose connection with the continent is hidden to us, as D'Alembert proclaimed, the encyclopedists still had to stuff that ocean in a book and give it form. To do so, they adapted Francis Bacon's order of knowledge and visualized their conceptual map as a tree diagram, as well as an arboreal engraving by Jean-Michel Papillon, as you can see on the right. And yet another century later, Darwin revived and reified tree logic by manifesting his theory of universal descent through a tree of life diagram. Quote, "The affinities of all the beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree," he wrote. "I believe this simile largely speaks the truth," end quote. Across the millennia, conceptual trees have aided with classification of orders of being, of species, of knowledge domains, and with determinations of kinship and evolution. And they served as conceptual tools for decision-making, for comparing affinities and determining identification, for assessing relations and legality and morality, for deciding where one belongs within a corporate structure or amidst a vast ocean of knowledge. Even in this computational age, when knowledge is increasingly shaped by algorithmic processes, tree logic persists. But only rarely do we ask what ethics are implied in the morphology of a decision tree, the one we see on the right here. What values are embodied in its root node? Most likely not God or metaphysics, as we saw earlier. What ethics and politics are implied by the sequencing of its branch nodes? What order, what ontology does it express? Countless critics have demonstrated how contemporary programmers and data scientists pay far too little attention to the ethics and politics of artificial intelligence. Their trees are enchanted and political and steeped in ethics and morality, much like Porphyry's and Hiawatha's, yet they're so often presumed to be impartial and innocent and kind of divorced from the capriciousness of human judgment. But there are other ways of conceiving of knowledge, and this last section is on embodied knowledges. As we've seen, history provides a veritable forest of cases demonstrating how arboreal data models lend themselves to critique. But we can also look to the decision tree's organic analogs for reminders of the algorithm's limitations. We see what a decision tree can't know, where the world simply can't yield itself up as processable data, or where the model's hierarchical form can't accommodate models of discernment or attunement that exceed its deductive logics. Trees, Jim Robbins writes, are giant organic recording devices that contain information about past climate, civilizations, ecosystems, even galactic events, much of it many thousands of years old. We count and scan tree rings to learn not only about the age of individual organisms, but also about the evolving world in which they grew. Some of that data can then be translated from arboreal to digital form and shared in an international tree ring databank. Arboreal encodings regarding historical precipitation and local water stores, temperature, and light availability can also help scientists construct climate change models and understand the impact of past methods of forest management, including cultivation and the use of controlled burns by many indigenous societies. Recognition of these indigenous practices demonstrates to Western scientists, policymakers, and conservation advocates not just how long many of our pristine forests have been effectively managed by their early inhabitants, but also how valuable traditional knowledge has been for responsible stewardship, and how incommensurable it is in many ways with data-driven ways of knowing. Indigenous stewards' arboreal agency is often informed by and influenced or inflected with ethical concerns, spiritual commitments, and political ontologies. As anthropologists Eduardo Cohn and Anna Singh have shown us, forests embody distinctive ontologies, sylvan ways of being, and different epistemologies and logics of operation. The sylvan logics revealed to a Runa hunter in Ecuador or to a Matsutake forager in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, are quite unlike the industrial forest rationalism imposed by a state forestry service or a logging company. Cohn ascribes agency and communicative capacity to ants and trees and dreams. He suggests that forests are good to think with because they themselves think. Singh thinks with the mushroom, which requires the dynamic multi-species diversity of the forest, with its contaminating relationality, rather than the monocrop, even-aged timber stands of the orderly tree plantation. The mushroom prefers the ruined landscapes of post-industrialized rationality. It grows only in deeply disturbed forest, only where people have caused significant deforestation, Singh writes. Its logic is irrational, resistant to scalability and optimization. There's been much talk in recent years of distinctive fungal or floral intelligences. Scientists have learned that trees respond to a host of stimuli: energy resources, light, minerals, and water, mechanical stimuli, soil structure, humidity, temperature, atmospheric gas composition, and various biotic signals, including the presence or absence of nearby plants, predators, or diseases. Plants can remember particular stresses like drought or extreme temperature or exposure to radiation. And they've evolved their own means of interspecies communication. You've likely heard of the Wood Wide Web, an underground network of mycorrhizal fungi that connect the roots of plants and trees, transferring water, carbon, and nutrients, sending chemical warnings of attack, and either nurturing desirable neighbors or sabotaging invasive ones. Anthropologist Natasha Singh suggests that we're fascinated with plant sensing, largely because such phenomena upend our thinking. They interrupt the order of things. These sylvan terrains embody an organic form of deep learning, to harken back to another kind of machine learning or artificial intelligence metaphor, whereas here, depth references both elevation and time. As he stood amidst the twisted, craggy denizens of the ancient bristlecone pine forest in the White Mountains in Eastern California, environmental scientist Andy Bunn wondered, what's the oldest tree? It's trivia, it's unanswerable. The fact that there's no hard verifiable data didn't faze him. He was interested in more existential ontological issues. Quote, I get a chill from standing next to something that's been living in the same place for 5,000 years. We can't begin to comprehend the mechanisms of birth and death on that scale, end quote. As philosopher Emmanuel Koshia explains, the relationship to death is different in trees. There's no struggle, that is, between the living and the dead body. That dead body often gives strength, balance, and stability to the whole, end quote. Yet there is a struggle when we consider the historical relationships between arboreal and human bodies, living and dead. Trees have served as signs and scaffolds that marked human bodies' passage into death, as sites where a soul's fate was decided and their execution effected. Some Native Americans, First Nation, Balinese, and Naga people suspended their deceased community members in trees to prevent their disturbance by animals or the elements. In the winter, burial in the frozen ground was sometimes impossible, so suspension was the only option. Jacek Malzinski describes how the trees at the Bałtyk concentration camp in Poland served not only as witnesses, but also as accomplices in the Holocaust. The camp was sited in the middle of a pine forest. The SS relied on the trees to provide security and obscurity. When the camp was closed, more trees were planted in its place on terrain that held human remains. These arboreal and human bodies are thus now materially integrated. The fate of many African Americans has been decided amidst the boughs of southern trees, and many northern trees as well, which, as Billie Holiday sang in 1939, bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Poet Paul Dunbar later examined lynching from the perspective of the tree itself. On the bough that bears the ban, I am burned with dread, I am dried and dead from the curse of a guiltless man. There's no logic, no fit, no purity. Again, I'm referencing all those terms that are so common in kind of decision tree language. None of that applies to the decisions executed in these trees. Yet the tree is a multi-branched symbol of both suffering and deliverance. It's an embodiment of knowledge and ignorance, of good and evil, as is evidenced in much African-American literature, including Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God and Toni Morrison's Beloved. Through his fieldwork in a cemetery restoration and documentation project in rural Georgia, anthropologist Mark Oslander found that for some of his respondents, trees evoked family resemblance and continuity. And although Oslander himself doesn't make a point of it, they also embodied a means of knowing and served as a tool for decision-making. One of his respondents noted that she uses the trees as guides to help her navigate through the cemetery. As she oriented herself in relation to the graves of various friends and family, she couldn't always remember where they were buried, but she, quote, went by the trees. Furthermore, she often refers to respected deceased female relatives as people who really knew the trees, meaning either that they were root workers, which meant traditional healers, or that she could find their grave sites by reading the landscape. Traditional healing, indigenous forest management, deep networks of interspecies communication. These are the forms of arboreal agency and sylvan intelligence that can stymie a decision tree. Data-driven dendrology and algorithmic arboreal administration can certainly aid in efforts to identify, count, classify, monitor, and model, but trees are more than aggregations, but forests, that is, are more than aggregations of trees. They're deep ecologies. Even the urban street tree resides in a complex biotechnical, social, political environment. Last year, the Dutch design studio Forma Phantasma launched a gorgeous show, Cambio, at the Serpentine Galleries in London. I regret that the pandemic kept me from visiting. The group's stunning research ramified into many gorgeously produced artifacts and videos, including this clip I'm about to show you, which both addresses the value of local embodied knowledges in forest management, while also providing a formal counterpoint to the Microsoft piece we saw earlier. Again, kind of more of those squares and green screens amidst the forest.
Although technological advancements and a more attentive regulation of trades and sourcing are essential in fighting deforestation all around the world, by far the best and most cost-effective solution for protecting forests and promoting sustainable forest management is to ensure community forest rights. Across several countries, where local communities have secure land tenure, deforestation was calculated to be significantly lower than in surrounding forested areas. Worldwide, local people have proved to be the best guardians of their habitat. Human livelihoods and culture depend on healthy forests.
So such an appreciation of ecological thinking was present even in the early days of scientific forestry. As engineered grids of trees were rising in Northern Europe in the late 18th century, naturalists were building new collections that sought to capture trees as holistic material entities. Xylotex hosted collections of preserved plant specimens. Each volume was a box made of a particular species wood. Its spine was covered with the corresponding bark, and its sides were composed of various tree cuts, horizontal slices of branches, cross-sections of trunk, samples of sapwood, mature wood, heartwood. Inside, one would find an assortment of anatomical parts, seed capsules, roots, leaves, buds, flowers, and wax models of its fruit. Annotations noted its properties, habitat, preferred soil, and use. These various arboreal archival objects could very well constitute distinctive branches on a decision tree grown to aid in identification, but they also embody modes of documentation through sight, touch, and even smell. If you can imagine ancient smells wafting from one of these boxes, these xylotexes as you open it up. These modes of documentation that a sensing body is well equipped to handle. Unfortunately, when we open up the xylotex boxes, we don't hear the fluttering of the wind in the leaves. Sound recording didn't exist for another 100 years after some of these boxes were made. But sound is indeed, ideally, another integral dynamic of the decision tree. We might think of the voices rising beneath these boughs, making concessions, offering proclamations, issuing decrees, declaring manifestos, rising in protest, crying in pain, cheering for liberty or death. But there's also the soundscape, the wind in the trees, the birds, the specific acoustic properties of the particular habitat. All of these are sources of deep ecological knowledge too. A few weeks ago, I happened upon a sound archive, tree.fm, which allows you to visit, look at, and listen to audio recordings from various forests around the world. I tweeted about it, and many housebound quarantiners seemed to find it powerfully moving. It was one of my most popular tweets of all time, which doesn't say much because my other kind of high-powered tweets were about interlibrary loan and beans. So I don't know what that tells you about me, but today's soundtrack, some of the things people said were, today's soundtrack, sending to everyone in cities in lockdown. What a gift. Hugging the sounds. I had no idea how much I needed this in my life. Best use of the internet right now. I'm so starved for other places. This almost made me cry. And someone actually did cry in emoji, as you can see in the bottom right. Yet my caption, you can listen to a random forest, seemed to mislead and actually frustrate some programmers. They were expecting to listen to the other kind of random forest. They wanted to listen to an algorithm. I had tricked them. Some thought I was being clever. I was just being earnest. You actually can listen to a randomly selected forest. And that's exactly what I think we need to do more often. Listen, feel, breathe, marvel. Sometimes a random forest is just a random forest. Let it be that in all its marvelous majesty and mystery and irrationality. The end. Thank you.